Okay, so we've got some seriously heavy stuff to unpack today, talking about Nihon Hidankyo, these incredible folks who survived the atomic bombings and then dedicated their lives to making sure it never happens again.
Yeah, it's hard to even grasp, like to live through something like that and then turn it into a message of peace. It's
It's mind-blowing, honestly.
we really is.
I mean, their story, it's not just about surviving, right? It's about what they did after that really makes them so important, especially right now.
Right, and that's what's so powerful about Nihon Hidankyo, formed in 1956. It's not just a name, it's a whole confederation of survivors from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the
Well, Hibakusha, yeah.
and their stories, they cut through all the noise, all the politics, and just hit you right in the gut.
It's true. You can't really ignore the human cost of nuclear war when you're hearing it directly from someone who lived through it.
Exactly. And what's really incredible is that for years after the bombings, there was this silence,
Yeah.
even like a suppression of what happened.
People didn't want to talk about it.
It took time for everyone, even the survivors, to really come to terms with what happened, with the full impact of nuclear war. And I think the formation of Nihon Hidankyo, it marks a turning point in how the world understood those events.
Yeah, it's like they decided they weren't going to be silenced anymore, that they had to speak out, share their stories so no one else would have to go through what they did.
And their motto, no more Hibakusha, it's so simple but so powerful.
It's so powerful, and it really gets to the core of their work, right?
Absolutely. Like their main goals have been all about advocating for the rights and well-being of Hibakusha, not just in Japan, but making sure people remember those impacted by nuclear testing all over the world, too.
Right, everywhere.
Yeah, it's a global issue, and they recognize that right from the start.
And it's interesting we're talking about them now because they just won the 2024 Nobel Peace Prize, which is amazing, but it also makes you think, what did they do to deserve this specifically? It's not just about surviving, it's about what they did after that really matters.
That's the key, right? The Nobel Committee called it a recognition of their role in building the nuclear taboo, basically, that idea that using these weapons is morally wrong. And the thing is, the Hibakusha, their testimonies were essential in making people understand that.
Right, they made it real.
They put faces, names, actual human experiences to this unimaginable tragedy.
They made it impossible to ignore.
Exactly. And I think, it's interesting, isn't it, how the Nobel Committee choosing them now, it kind of reflects what we're all feeling these days, like that nuclear taboo, that feeling that using these weapons is unthinkable. It's not so certain anymore,
No, it's not.
And the sources you sent, they paint a really vivid picture of what it was like back then in the 1950s, with the Cold War going on, constant nuclear testing. That fear was just everywhere.
You can feel it in the air.
Exactly. And yet, even in the middle of all that, Nihon Hidankyo, they chose activism. They chose hope.
It's remarkable. And to think they were doing all this when support for survivors was, well, pretty much non-existent.
It's true. This wasn't some big, well-funded organization. It was grassroots, ordinary people coming together to say, never again.
Exactly. And they didn't just keep their message in Japan. They took it global really early on. In 1957, they joined these delegations to the Soviet Union, China, even Mongolia. Can you imagine?
Wow.
At the height of the Cold War, they were bridging these huge ideological divides just to share their message.
That's incredible. And they didn't just talk, they took action, right? Like in the 1970s when they were petitioning the UN, pushing for treaties to ban nuclear weapons before things like the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty even existed.
Yeah, they knew how urgent their message was, but what's amazing is it wasn't about anger or revenge or anything like that. It was about peace, about understanding, about preventing this horror from ever happening again.
And I think as we keep going with this deep dive, that's the message we really need to hold on to.
It really makes you think about the strength it took for them to do that.
Yeah. I mean, after going through something so horrific, to then turn around and dedicate themselves to this kind of activism,
It's incredible.
It really is. And like you were saying before, that whole idea of the nuclear taboo feeling less certain these days, it makes their message even more important, even more urgent.
Absolutely. And the Nobel Committee, they even said as much, pointing to all the signs, how countries are modernizing their arsenals, how new countries are trying to get their hands on these weapons, the threats being thrown around in conflicts today. It's a scary world out there.
It really is, and it's easy to forget that sometimes, It's easy to get caught up in the day-to-day and feel like those threats are a world away, something you see on the news, but not something that could ever really happen.
Right. It's like it's all just headlines.
Exactly.
But then you read these stories, these firsthand accounts from the Hibakusha, and it suddenly becomes very real.
They bring it home.
They do. And, what's interesting is that for a lot of them, even talking about their experiences was incredibly difficult at first.
Oh, I can only imagine. The trauma, the stigma, the fear surrounding radiation sickness, they carried all of that with them. And yet, they still chose to share their stories with the world.
It's an incredible act of courage when you think about it, to go through something so horrific and then to relive it over and over again so that maybe, just maybe, no one else will have to experience it.
Exactly, and that's what they've been doing for almost 70 years now. Nihon Hidankyo has been working tirelessly, sending delegations all around the world, speaking at conferences, talking to anyone who will listen. They've dedicated their lives to making sure we understand the real cost of nuclear war.
And what I find so remarkable is that through it all, they've never advocated for revenge, never for retaliation.
No.
It's always been about peace, about disarmament, about collective responsibility, not about pointing fingers.
You said it, remember earlier we were talking about how they were building bridges during the Cold War, reaching out to countries on opposite sides of the conflict?
Yeah.
That's what made their message so powerful.
It makes you think, if they could find common ground in a world that was so divided, what's stopping us from doing the same thing now? Especially when the threat feels even more real, more immediate.
It's a good question, and it's something we all need to think about, because here's the thing. The Hibakusha, these incredible people who've dedicated their lives to this cause, they won't be with us forever.
That's true.
This Nobel Prize, their stories, it's all part of a legacy, something they're passing on to us.
But where do we go from here? How do we make sure their message isn't forgotten? What do you think our listeners should take away from all of this? It really makes you think, about how we keep their message alive, how we make sure their sacrifices weren't for nothing.
Yeah, and it's not just about remembering what happened, right? It's about learning from it, about taking action to make sure it never happens again.
The sources you sent, they talk about this culture of remembrance that's starting to emerge, both in Japan and around the world. What do you think that looks like, practically speaking?
Well, it's more than just memorials and museums, although those are definitely important. It's about actively engaging with the stories of the Hibakusha, understanding what they went through, and seeing the connections to the problems we're facing in the world today.
It's about making it relevant to our lives, to what's happening right now.
Exactly.
And, it's interesting, when you think about how long Nihon Hidankyo was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize before actually winning it, this year, in 2024, you have to wonder, why now?
It's hard not to see it as a response to everything that's going on in the world, right? With the war in Ukraine, the tensions with China, all these nuclear threats. It feels like we're closer to the brink than we've been in decades.
It's scary.
It is.
And I think the Nobel Committee, by choosing Nihon Hidankyo for this award, they're not just recognizing the past, they're sending a message about the present.
Absolutely. It's a recognition for sure, but it's also a warning.
A wake-up call, almost.
Exactly. Like, hey, this is serious. We need to pay attention.
So what can we do? How do we make sure this message doesn't just fade away? What can our listeners do, starting today, to really make a difference?
Well, I think it starts with education, Staying informed about what's happening, reading about nuclear weapons, learning about the history, having those tough conversations with friends and family who might not be paying attention.
And not being afraid to speak out, right?
Exactly, because silence only benefits the people in power who want to keep things the way they are. We need to be loud. We need to be vocal. We need to demand change.
And there are organizations out there doing amazing work on this issue, groups like.
Oh, absolutely. And supporting them, whether it's through donations or volunteering or just helping to spread the word, that all makes a difference.
Every little bit counts.
It really does. And I think ultimately it comes down to recognizing our shared humanity, remembering that these weapons, they don't discriminate, they don't care about borders or ideologies.
They affect all of us.
Exactly. We're all in this together. And it's up to us to create a future where these weapons are nothing more than a distant memory.
That's a powerful message, and one that I hope our listeners will carry with them. The Hibakusha have shown us what it means to face unimaginable horror and still choose hope, to turn their pain into a call for peace and a better future for all of us.
And that's a legacy worth fighting for.
It really is. And on that note, we'll leave you with this. If a group of survivors can dedicate their lives to building a world free from nuclear weapons, then what's stopping the rest of us from joining them?